October 28th, 312 AD. Constantine stood at the gates of Rome with 40,000 exhausted soldiers, staring across the Tiber at Maxentius's 100,000-strong army. The largest force assembled in the empire since the civil wars that had killed 20 emperors in 50 years. By sunset, the Tiber would run red with 20,000 corpses. Maxentius would drown in his own armor. And Constantine would march into Rome carrying a vision that would change human civilization forever. A cross of light and 4 words that shouldn't have been possible. Think about those numbers. 40,000 invaders against 100,000 defenders with Rome's walls at their backs. That's a 2.5.1 disadvantage before the battle even started. Yet by the end of this video, you'll understand how Constantine turned certain annihilation into the most consequential military victory in Western history. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will shatter everything you thought you knew about this battle. First, the vision that transformed Constantine's army from terrified conscripts into religious fanatics willing to die. Second, the catastrophic engineering failure that turned Maxentius's pontoon bridge into a death trap for 10,000 men. And third, why Constantine's victory at Milvian Bridge didn't just change Rome. It changed the entire trajectory of Western civilization for the next 700 years. But here's what makes this truly insane. How did Constantine convince 40,000 soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields when 90% of them worshipped the old gods? What made Maxentius abandon Rome's impregnable walls to fight in the open? Why did the Praetorian Guard, Rome's most elite troops who'd murdered 6 emperors, break and run? And how did a single collapsing bridge kill more men in 30 minutes than the entire battle? To understand how Constantine rewrote history in one afternoon, we need to go back to the moment when Rome had 4 emperors and no one in control. May 305 AD. The Roman Empire had survived the barbarian invasions, civil wars, and economic collapse. But nothing had prepared it for Diocletian's retirement plan. The emperor who'd held the empire together through sheer force of will had done the unthinkable. He'd voluntarily abdicated, split the empire into 4 pieces called the tetrarchy, and assumed his 4 successors wouldn't immediately try to murder each other. Within 7 years, the tetrarchy had collapsed into chaos. Constantine controlled Gaul and Britain. Maxentius held Italy and North Africa. Licinius commanded the Balkans. Maximinus Daza ruled the East. 4 men, 4 armies, and 1 capital city that could only have 1 emperor. By 312 AD, Constantine had decided that emperor would be him, even if it meant marching on Rome itself, something no Roman general had dared since the year of the 4 emperors in 69 AD. A civil war that had killed 50,000 and nearly destroyed the empire. Here's what made Diocletian's system genuinely insane. It was designed to prevent exactly what was happening. The tetrarchy wasn't just administrative division. It was supposed to be a self-regulating machine where senior emperors, Augusti, ruled for 20 years, then peacefully retired and handed power to their junior partners, Caesars, who would promote new Caesars from the ranks of proven generals. No hereditary succession, no civil wars, no ambitious sons murdering their fathers for the purple. Diocletian had even built himself a retirement palace in Split, a massive fortified compound where he planned to spend his final years growing cabbages and congratulating himself on saving Rome from itself. The palace still stands today, a monument to the most naive political theory in Roman history. The system lasted exactly 18 months after Diocletian's abdication. By 306 AD, Constantine's father Constantius had died campaigning in Britain, and Constantine's troops, in direct violation of tetrarchy succession rules, had proclaimed him Augustus on the spot. Maxentius, meanwhile, had staged a coup in Rome with Praetorian backing, declaring himself emperor despite having zero official authority. Licinius and Maximinus Daza were maneuvering in the east, each building armies and waiting for the inevitable bloodbath. 4 emperors, none of whom recognized the other's legitimacy, all commanding legions, all needing to eliminate rivals before those rivals eliminated them. The military mathematics were staggering. Between them, the 4 emperors controlled approximately 400,000 soldiers, the entire remaining strength of Rome's professional army. Constantine commanded roughly 90,000 troops defending the Rhine frontier and garrisoning Britain. Maxentius held perhaps 120,000 men across Italy, Sicily, and North Africa, including the 10,000 Praetorian Guards who'd put him in power. Licinius controlled 100,000 soldiers in the Balkans and Danube frontier. Maximinus Daza commanded 90,000 defending the eastern provinces against Persia. Think about those numbers. Rome's entire military force, which had once conquered the Mediterranean and held back barbarian Europe, was now divided into 4 pieces that would inevitably fight each other instead of defending the empire's crumbling borders. But here's where the situation became catastrophic. The frontiers were collapsing while the emperors prepared for civil war. Germanic tribes were pushing across the Rhine. Goths were raiding the Balkans. Berber insurgents controlled large swaths of North Africa. Persia was testing Rome's eastern defenses. And instead of coordinating their responses, the 4 emperors were pulling troops away from border defense to concentrate forces for the coming internal wars. Every legion transferred from frontier garrison to civil war staging area was an invitation for barbarians to cross unmolested. Constantine understood the strategic insanity better than his rivals. He'd spent 6 years fighting Franks and Alemanni along the Rhine, real wars against foreign enemies who wanted to destroy Rome, not political theater about who deserved the purple. He'd watched his father die on campaign in Britain, trying to hold the northern frontier against Pictish raids. Constantine knew the empire was dying from external pressure, and civil war was accelerating the collapse. But he also knew that the tetrarchy's failure meant only one solution: total victory. 1 emperor, 1 army, 1 Rome. Everything else was slow suicide. By spring 312 AD, the situation had clarified into brutal simplicity. Maxentius controlled Rome itself, the symbolic heart of the empire, the city that gave emperors their legitimacy. As long as Maxentius held Rome, he could claim to be the true Augustus, and Constantine was just another provincial usurper. Constantine would have to march on Rome, something considered unthinkable since Sulla had done it in 82 BC and triggered decades of civil war. No general attacked Rome. You negotiated, you maneuvered, you waited for political opportunity. You didn't march legions against the eternal city itself. Constantine chose to do the unthinkable. In July 312 AD, he gathered 40,000 soldiers, half his total available forces, stripped from every garrison he dared weaken, and began the march south. His officers argued it was suicide. His advisors calculated that Maxentius could field 100,000 men defending Rome's walls, which hadn't fallen to assault in 800 years. The odds were catastrophic, the precedent terrifying, the outcome predictable. Another failed usurper, whose head would decorate the Gemonian stairs. But Constantine had one advantage none of his officers understood yet. In 3 months, he would stand outside Rome's gates with a cross painted on his shields and a vision of divine victory that would transform 40,000 terrified soldiers into religious fanatics. And 6 hours after that, Maxentius would be drowning in the Tiber, while 20,000 of his men died around him. The march on Rome had begun, and the world was about to change forever. October 306 AD. Maxentius wasn't supposed to be emperor at all. He was the son of Maximian, one of Diocletian's retired co-emperors. But the tetrarchy's succession rules had specifically excluded him. He had the bloodline, but not the political backing. So Maxentius did what ambitious Romans had done for centuries. He bribed the Praetorian Guard, seized Rome in a coup, and declared himself emperor while his father's successor was away. The Praetorian Guard, 10,000 elite soldiers who'd spent 300 years making and breaking emperors, backed him because Maxentius promised to restore their privileges, double their pay, and let them run Rome like a protection racket. By 312 AD, Maxentius had been emperor for 6 years, controlled the wealthiest provinces in the empire, commanded an army of 100,000, and had the strongest defensive position in the Roman world. The walls of Rome itself, which hadn't fallen to a siege since the Gauls sacked the city 700 years earlier. Constantine was marching an exhausted army of 40,000 across the Alps to attack a fortified city defended by more than twice his numbers. Every military advisor told him it was suicide. The coup itself had been brutally efficient. On October 28, 306 AD, exactly 6 years before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, which is either cosmic irony or terrifying foreshadowing, Maxentius walked into the Praetorian Guard's fortress with chests containing 5,000 gold auri. That's 350 pounds of gold, enough to give each Praetorian Guardsman a bonus worth 6 months' pay. The deal was explicit. Proclaim me emperor, and I'll triple your privileges, exempt you from taxes, and let you police Rome however you want. The Praetorians, who'd been watching Diocletian's reforms strip away their power and prestige for 20 years, took approximately 3 minutes to accept. By sunset, they'd surrounded the Senate, forced the senators to acclaim Maxentius as Augustus, and executed anyone who objected. The legitimate emperor, Severus, who'd been appointed through proper tetrarchy channels, was campaigning in North Africa and didn't even know he'd been overthrown until messengers arrived 3 weeks later with the news that Rome had a new master. Here's what the official histories don't tell you about Maxentius's consolidation of power. It was soaked in blood. When Severus marched on Rome in 307 AD to restore legitimate authority, Maxentius didn't fight him in open battle. He bribed Severus's own soldiers to desert. Entire legions switched sides when Maxentius's agents arrived in their camps offering gold and land grants. Severus, watching his army dissolve through defection, surrendered and was promptly executed. Sources disagree whether he was strangled, forced to commit suicide, or simply murdered in his cell. The body was displayed in the Forum as a warning. Total time from Severus's arrival outside Rome to his death: 6 weeks. Maxentius's father Maximian tried to reclaim power in 308 AD, staging his own coup against his son. Maxentius responded by besieging his own father in Marseille, starving him into surrender, then forcing him to commit suicide. When Maximian's body was recovered, Maxentius gave him a state funeral and proclaimed 7 days of mourning while simultaneously purging every official who'd supported the old emperor. The purge killed approximately 800 senators, administrators, and officers. One of the largest political massacres in Roman history. Think about that. Maxentius murdered his own father, then used the funeral to identify and eliminate political opponents who'd mourned too convincingly. By 312 AD, Maxentius had transformed Rome from the Senate-controlled symbolic heart of the empire into a military dictatorship run by the Praetorian Guard. The numbers tell the story. In 305 AD, Rome's population was approximately 650,000. By 312, it had dropped to 580,000 hollers. 70,000 people had fled, been killed in purges, or died in the food riots that followed. Maxentius's confiscation of grain supplies to feed his expanding army. The Praetorians patrolled the streets like an occupying force. Senators who'd once commanded legions and governed provinces now attended meetings surrounded by guards who could execute them on Maxentius's word. Rome had survived barbarian invasions, civil wars, and the crisis of the 3rd century. But Maxentius had turned it into a prison ruled by the men who were supposed to protect it. But here's where Maxentius's paranoid brutality became his greatest strategic advantage. It made him impossible to overthrow from within. Every potential rival was dead, exiled, or too terrified to act. The Praetorian Guard's loyalty was absolute because their survival depended on his. If Maxentius fell, the next emperor would disband them for their crimes. The army was paid regularly with wealth confiscated from purged senators. The common people hated him, but hatred without organization is just noise. Maxentius had created a regime that could only be destroyed by external force, which meant Constantine couldn't count on internal rebellion or defection. He'd have to break Maxentius's army in open battle. And Maxentius, watching from Rome as Constantine's 40,000 exhausted soldiers crossed the Alps in October 312, had every reason to believe he was unbeatable. His scouts reported Constantine's forces were depleted from fighting their way through northern Italy. Victories at Turin and Verona had cost Constantine perhaps 8,000 casualties, men he couldn't replace. Maxentius commanded 100,000 fresh troops who'd been drilling in Rome for months. He controlled the Aurelian walls, 19 feet of solid stone surrounding 12 miles of city perimeter, studded with 381 towers and 18 fortified gates that could withstand any siege equipment Constantine could deploy. He had 2 years' worth of grain stored in Rome's warehouses and access to the Tiber for water. Constantine, by contrast, had no siege equipment, no supply lines, and an army that would start deserting within weeks if they camped outside Rome's walls without fighting. Every calculation said Maxentius should stay behind those walls and let Constantine's army dissolve from attrition and hunger. But Maxentius had spent 6 years murdering his way to absolute power. And absolute power had made him believe he was invincible. When his priests consulted the Sibylline books and reported that the enemy of Rome would die on October 28th, Maxentius assumed the prophecy meant Constantine. He assumed the gods themselves had promised him victory. And that assumption, that divine mandate combined with military superiority, would lead him to make the most catastrophic tactical decision of his life: marching his army out of Rome's impregnable walls to fight Constantine in the open, where numbers and walls meant nothing, and where 10,000 of his soldiers would drown in the Tiber, while he watched from the collapsing pontoon bridge that was supposed to guarantee his victory. October 27th, 312 AD, the day before the battle. Constantine's army camped 9 miles north of Rome, and the soldiers were terrified. They'd marched 1,000 miles from Gaul, fought 3 battles in northern Italy, lost thousands to attrition and desertion, and now faced an enemy that outnumbered them catastrophically. Morale was shattering. Then Constantine claimed to see something in the sky above the setting sun, a cross of light with Greek words written beneath it. En Teutonica, in this sign, conquer. That night, Constantine reportedly had a dream where Christ himself appeared and told him to paint the Chi symbol, the first 2 letters of Christ in Greek, on every shield in his army. When dawn broke on October 28th, Constantine's soldiers were marching toward Rome with Christian symbols painted over their shields, even though most of them still worshiped Jupiter, Mars, and Mithras. Here's what makes this genuinely insane. Constantine wasn't Christian. His father had tolerated Christians, but never converted. Constantine himself had spent his entire military career sacrificing to the traditional Roman gods before battle. But standing 9 miles from Rome with impossible odds, Constantine made a calculated gamble. He'd bet everything on a god his soldiers barely knew, because the old gods clearly weren't enough to beat Maxentius. The vision itself, whether genuine religious experience, calculated propaganda, or solar phenomenon misinterpreted through desperation, came at the precise moment Constantine's campaign was collapsing. His scouts had just returned with reports that devastated the command tent. Maxentius had 100,000 men deployed north of the Tiber, positioned between Constantine's army and Rome. The Aurelian walls were fully manned. Every gate was fortified. The grain supplies Constantine had hoped to capture in the countryside had been burned by Maxentius's scorched earth parties. Constantine's army was eating through its remaining supplies at 20 tons per day. Bread, salted pork, wine, fodder for 15,000 cavalry horses. At current consumption rates, they had 8 days of food left. After that, the army would dissolve through starvation and desertion faster than Maxentius would need to fight them. Constantine's officers were arguing for retreat. Marcus Flavius, his senior cavalry commander, laid out the mathematics with brutal clarity. We have 40,000 effectives after the casualties at Turin and Verona. Maxentius fields 100,000 fresh troops. We're outnumbered 2.5 to 1 before accounting for Rome's walls and his defensive position. If we attack, we die. If we siege, we starve. If we retreat, your claim to the throne dies with your reputation. The tent went silent. Every man present understood they were watching Constantine's invasion. 6 months of planning, 1,000 miles of marching, 3 victories in northern Italy, and not in battle, but in the slow humiliation of a hungry army retreating north while Maxentius mocked them from Rome's walls. That's when Constantine walked out of the tent and saw the vision, or claimed to see it. The historical sources, Lactantius writing within 3 years of the event, Eusebius recording Constantine's own account decades later, agree on the basic details but differ on specifics. A cross of light, words in Greek, a divine promise of victory. What matters isn't whether the vision was real. It's what Constantine did with it. He spent that night consulting with a handful of Christians in his army, maybe 2,000 soldiers out of 40,000, asking them about their God's symbols and promises. The chi rho, the overlapping Greek letters X and P forming a monogram that represented Christ's name, became his choice. Simple enough to paint quickly, distinctive enough that every soldier would recognize they were marching under a new God's protection. Here's where Constantine's genius becomes apparent. He didn't order his men to convert. He didn't demand they abandon Jupiter or Mars or Mithras. He simply told them to paint a symbol on their shields and promised that this God, this Christ who'd supposedly conquered death itself, would give them victory against impossible odds. For soldiers who'd marched 1,000 miles into a death trap, who faced an army twice their size, who had 8 days of food and no retreat options, that promise was psychologically revolutionary. The old gods had brought them to the edge of annihilation. Maybe a new god could save them. By 4 a.m. on October 28th, 40,000 soldiers were painting the chi rho on their shields by torchlight. The symbol was crude. 2 letters in white paint, hastily daubed over the eagle emblems and unit insignia that had marked Roman shields for centuries. But the psychological effect was immediate and powerful. These men were no longer just Constantine's army fighting another Roman civil war. They were crusaders marching under divine mandate, believers in a God who promised victory to the faithful. Think about that transformation. In 6 hours, Constantine had converted a demoralized, outnumbered, starving army into religious warriors who believed their God had personally guaranteed they couldn't lose. The Christian soldiers in Constantine's ranks, that small minority who'd actually worshipped Christ before the vision, became instant evangelists. They moved through the camp explaining the symbol's meaning, telling stories of Christian martyrs who'd faced death without fear, promising that this God didn't just offer victory in battle, but eternal life after death. For soldiers who understood they might die in the next 12 hours, that promise of immortality was more valuable than gold. If you're going to charge into an army twice your size, better to believe you're fighting for a God who guarantees paradise than for an emperor who might execute you for failure. But here's what the Christian chroniclers tried to hide. Constantine hedged his bets. Even as his soldiers painted Christian symbols on their shields, Constantine himself sacrificed to Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, the traditional god of Roman emperors, at dawn on October 28th. His coins minted after the battle would show both Christian and pagan imagery. His official proclamations would credit both Christ and the traditional gods. Constantine wasn't experiencing religious conversion. He was executing military psychology. He'd given his desperate army something to believe in, a narrative where their impossible situation became divine test, where dying against impossible odds became martyrdom instead of military failure. At 6 a.m., as the army formed up for the march toward Rome, Constantine rode along the ranks, showing them his own shield, emblazoned with the Chi-Rho in gold leaf, clearly visible against the red leather. The message was explicit. Your emperor marches under this symbol, and this god has promised victory. The soldiers cheered, not because they understood Christian theology or had converted in their hearts, but because Constantine had given them hope when every rational calculation said they were doomed. And hope, combined with desperation, creates the most dangerous soldiers in human history. Men who fight like they have nothing to lose because they literally don't. Empowered by the belief that their cause is righteous and their victory ordained by forces beyond human understanding. By 8 a.m., Constantine's army was marching toward the Tiber, with crosses painted on their shields and prayers to a god most of them didn't know on their lips. And waiting for them across the river, Maxentius was deploying 100,000 soldiers who worshipped the old gods, trusted in traditional Roman discipline, and had no idea they were about to face an army that believed divine intervention had made them invincible. The vision, real or fabricated, genuine or calculated, had achieved exactly what Constantine needed. It had turned certain defeat into possible martyrdom, and men fight very differently when they believe heaven is watching. October 28th, 312 AD, dawn. Maxentius sat in the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill and made the most catastrophic military decision of his life. He would march his army out of Rome and fight Constantine in the open. Think about what he was abandoning. The Aurelian walls surrounding Rome were 12 miles of fortified stone, 20 feet tall, studded with towers and gates that could withstand siege equipment Rome itself had invented. Maxentius had 100,000 soldiers, enough grain stored to feed the city for 2 years, and access to the Tiber for water. Constantine had no siege equipment, no supply lines, and an army that would start deserting within weeks if they camped outside Rome's walls without fighting. Every principle of Roman military doctrine said, stay behind the walls, let Constantine waste his army on a siege he couldn't win. Watch him retreat in failure. But Maxentius consulted the Sibylline books, Rome's collection of prophetic texts, and the priests interpreted the oracle to mean that the enemy of Rome would die that day. Maxentius assumed the prophecy meant Constantine. He assumed wrong. By noon, he would be drowning in the Tiber, weighed down by his own armor, exactly as the prophecy predicted. The Sibylline prophecy was delivered at 5 a.m. by the College of Quindecimviri. 15 priests who'd spent the night reading the ancient Greek hexameters looking for divine guidance. The exact text they reported has been lost, but multiple sources agree on the interpretation they gave Maxentius. On this day, the enemy of Rome shall perish. Those 7 words convinced Maxentius to abandon the most defensible position in the empire and march 100,000 men out to face Constantine in open battle. Let that sink in. An empire's fate, decided by priests interpreting poetry written by a mythical Greek oracle supposedly thousands of years old, delivered to an emperor desperate enough to believe that the gods themselves had guaranteed his victory. Here's what made Maxentius's decision genuinely insane from a military perspective. Rome had never fallen to direct assault. The Aurelian walls, completed in 275 AD, just 37 years before this moment, were specifically designed to make Rome impregnable. 20 feet of solid stone and brick, built in a double wall configuration with a 15-foot gap between inner and outer walls that could be filled with rubble if siege equipment damaged the outer layer. 381 towers spaced every 100 feet, each one capable of mounting ballistae and catapults to rain projectiles on attackers. 18 fortified gates with murder holes, portcullises, and defensive positions that turned each entrance into a killing zone. The last time anyone had successfully besieged Rome was 390 BC. The Gallic sack, 702 years earlier. Every siege attempt since had failed or been abandoned. Maxentius's own military advisors begged him to stay behind those walls. Ruritius Pompeianus, his most experienced general who'd commanded legions on the Danube frontier for 20 years, laid out the strategic reality with brutal clarity. Constantine has 40,000 exhausted men, no siege equipment, and 8 days of supplies. We have 100,000 fresh troops, 2 years of grain, and walls that have never been breached. If we stay inside Rome, Constantine's army dissolves through desertion within a month. If we march out to fight him, we abandon our greatest advantage, the walls, and risk everything on a single battle we don't need to fight. The other commanders echoed Pompeianus's assessment. Stay defensive. Let time and hunger do the killing. Constantine would be forced to retreat or watch his army starve. And either outcome meant victory without risking a single soldier. But Maxentius wasn't thinking like a general. He was thinking like a man who'd spent 6 years murdering rivals, bribing the Praetorian Guard, and consolidating power through paranoid brutality. He'd survived this long by being aggressive, by striking first, by trusting his instincts over military doctrine. And his instincts, combined with the Sibylline prophecy, told him that hiding behind walls made him look weak, cowardly, afraid of Constantine. Think about the political psychology. Maxentius had proclaimed himself emperor through force, held Rome through intimidation, and ruled through the Praetorian Guard's backing. His entire authority rested on the perception that he was strong, decisive, divinely favored. If he cowered behind walls while Constantine camped outside hurling insults, that perception would crack. The Senate would whisper. The people would mock. The Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty was purchased, not earned, might start calculating whether backing Constantine would be more profitable than defending a coward. There was another factor driving Maxentius's decision, one the Christian chronicles deliberately obscured. Constantine's Chi Rho symbols had reached Rome before his army did. Deserters, scouts, terrified messengers, they all brought the same report. Constantine's soldiers were marching under Christian symbols, claiming divine protection, fighting with fanatical courage because they believed Christ himself had promised them victory. Maxentius, who'd spent his reign persecuting Christians and confiscating church property, suddenly faced an army that believed their God was personally intervening against him. That psychological warfare was devastating. The prophecy gave Maxentius a counter-narrative. The traditional gods of Rome, the Sibylline oracle, divine authority older than Christianity itself, promising that the enemy would die today. At 6 a.m., Maxentius gave the order to march. 100,000 soldiers began filing out of Rome through the northern gates, crossing the Milvian bridge and the newly constructed pontoon bridge, deploying in battle formation on the northern bank of the Tiber. The logistics were staggering. Moving that many men, horses, equipment across 2 bridges took 3 hours. By 9 a.m., Maxentius's entire army was positioned with their backs to Rome, facing north toward Constantine's approaching forces. The deployment was textbook Roman warfare. Infantry center, heavy cavalry on the flanks, Praetorian Guard holding the position of honor on the right wing near the Tiber. Everything was positioned perfectly for a defensive battle that would let superior numbers grind Constantine's smaller force into annihilation. But here's what Maxentius hadn't considered. He'd just placed his army with the Tiber at their backs. In Roman military doctrine, that's called a desperate position. You fight with a river behind you when you want to prevent retreat and force your men to win or die. But Maxentius wasn't trying to prevent retreat. He had Rome's walls to fall back to if things went badly. What he'd actually done was create a trap for his own army. If his forces broke and ran, they'd have to retreat across 2 bridges, one permanent stone structure that could handle maybe 500 men at a time, and one pontoon bridge that his engineers had built with a collapsible center section designed to trap enemy forces, not save fleeing allies. By 10 a.m., both armies were in position, and Maxentius was watching from his command position near the Praetorian Guard, confident that the Sibylline prophecy had guaranteed his victory. He had superior numbers, better position, divine mandate. Constantine was outnumbered, exhausted, desperate. The prophecy had said the enemy of Rome would die today. Maxentius assumed that meant Constantine. He never considered that the prophecy might be correct, but the interpretation was fatally wrong. That the real enemy of Rome wasn't the invader from Gaul, but the usurper who'd murdered his way to power, turned the eternal city into a military dictatorship, and was about to lead 100,000 Romans to their deaths because he'd believed what he wanted to hear instead of what the oracle actually said. In 4 hours, Maxentius would understand his mistake as the Tiber closed over his head, and the weight of his imperial armor dragged him down to drown in sight of the city he'd refused to defend from behind its impregnable walls. October 28th, dawn. While Constantine's army advanced from the north, Maxentius's engineers were completing a military engineering project that would kill more Romans than the entire battle. A pontoon bridge across the Tiber. Here's the context. The Milvian Bridge, the permanent stone bridge that carried the Via Flaminia across the Tiber into Rome, was only wide enough for troops to cross 4 abreast. If Maxentius marched 100,000 men across it to meet Constantine, the deployment would take hours, and Constantine could attack the vanguard before the rear guard even crossed. So Maxentius's engineers built a secondary pontoon bridge 200 yards downstream. A temporary structure of boats lashed together with wooden planks on top, designed to let his army cross quickly and deploy in full battle formation on the north bank. The design was standard Roman military engineering. The execution was catastrophic. The engineers built the pontoon bridge with a hidden collapsible section that could be triggered to drop, severing the bridge and trapping Constantine's army on the south bank if they tried to cross. It was a clever tactical trap. But here's what Maxentius didn't account for. What happens when your own army needs to retreat across a bridge designed to collapse on command? In 6 hours, that question would answer itself with 10,000 Roman corpses floating down the Tiber. The pontoon bridge's construction had begun 3 days earlier, on October 25th. When Maxentius's military engineers received orders to build a secondary crossing capable of moving 50,000 troops in under 2 hours. The specifications were demanding, but achievable. Roman military engineers had been building pontoon bridges for centuries, temporary structures that let armies cross rivers without depending on permanent bridges that enemies could destroy or defend. The design was simple. Requisition every boat in Rome's harbor on the Tiber, approximately 120 vessels ranging from fishing boats to merchant barges. Lash them together in a line across the river using iron chains and thick rope. Lay wooden planks across the boats to create a roadway 15 feet wide. Anchor the whole structure to both banks with heavy pilings driven into the riverbed. Total construction time with 500 engineers working in shifts, 60 hours. But Maxentius's head engineer, a man named Gaius Apronius, who'd built bridges across the Danube during the wars against the Goths, added a feature that seemed tactically brilliant: a collapsible center section. The middle 30 feet of the bridge was constructed differently from the rest. The boats in that section were connected with ropes instead of chains, and the planking was laid loosely rather than nailed down. Hidden beneath the planks were quick-release mechanisms, iron pins that could be pulled to instantly sever the rope connections and drop the entire center section into the river. The tactical logic was elegant. If Constantine's forces broke through Maxentius's lines and tried to pursue across the pontoon bridge into Rome, Maxentius's engineers could trigger the collapse, dropping Constantine's vanguard into the Tiber and stranding the rest on the north bank, where Maxentius's reserve forces could slaughter them. Apronius demonstrated the mechanism to Maxentius on October 27th, showing how 2 engineers pulling simultaneously on concealed iron rings could collapse the bridge in under 10 seconds. Maxentius was delighted. He'd turned his retreat route into a tactical weapon. What Apronius didn't mention, because Maxentius didn't ask, was what would happen if the collapse was triggered while Maxentius's own forces were crossing. The answer was obvious to any engineer, but apparently not to an emperor who'd never built anything more complex than a political coalition: catastrophic mass drowning. A pontoon bridge doesn't fail gracefully. When the center section drops, the structural integrity of the entire span is compromised. The boats on either side of the gap, suddenly free from their anchoring to the center, swing loose in the current. The planking shifts and buckles. And anyone on the bridge when this happens, weighed down with 60 pounds of armor, weapons, and equipment, goes into the water with zero chance of swimming to safety. Here's what makes the design genuinely insane. Apronius positioned the collapse mechanism's control station on the south bank of the Tiber, inside Rome's walls, assuming that's where Maxentius's command position would remain throughout the battle. But when Maxentius decided to march his entire army north of the river to meet Constantine in the open, the engineers who knew how to operate the mechanism stayed with their equipment on the south bank. The soldiers who'd actually trigger the collapse in combat, junior officers attached to Maxentius's headquarters, received maybe 30 minutes of training on how the system worked. Think about that. A sophisticated engineering mechanism designed to collapse on command, operated by men who'd never used it before, positioned to destroy the only viable retreat route for 100,000 soldiers if something went wrong. The pontoon bridge completed construction at 7 a.m. on October 28th, exactly as Maxentius's army began crossing both bridges to deploy north of the Tiber. The Milvian Bridge, solid stone, 430 years old, built to last centuries, carried approximately 40,000 infantry across in tight formation, 4 men abreast, a process that took nearly 3 hours. The pontoon bridge handled the remaining 60,000 troops, cavalry, artillery, supplies, the Praetorian Guard, in just under 2 hours because its 15-foot width allowed 12 men to cross side by side. The deployment was efficient, professional, exactly what Roman military engineering was designed to achieve. By 10 a.m., Maxentius's entire force was positioned on the north bank in perfect battle formation, and the pontoon bridge sat empty behind them, its collapsible center section armed and ready to trap Constantine's forces if they tried to cross. But here's where Roman military doctrine collided with Maxentius's overconfidence. Standard practice when fighting with a river at your back is to destroy the bridges behind you, forcing your army to win or die with no retreat option. It's a desperate tactic that channels fear into fighting courage. Your soldiers know they can't run, so they fight harder. Maxentius rejected this approach because he believed the Sibylline prophecy guaranteed victory. He wanted those bridges intact so he could pursue Constantine's broken army north when the enemy fled. The pontoon bridge, with its clever collapse mechanism, would let him chase Constantine while denying Constantine the same advantage in reverse. It was tactically sophisticated and strategically delusional, the kind of plan that assumes everything will go exactly right because the gods have promised success. By 10:30 a.m., both armies were in position, and the pontoon bridge sat 200 yards downstream from the Milvian bridge, empty, waiting. Maxentius's engineers had returned to Rome, their job complete. The junior officers who controlled the collapse mechanism were positioned with Maxentius's headquarters, watching the battle develop. The bridge itself, 120 boats, thousands of feet of rope and chain, wooden planking laid across a river that flowed at 3 miles per hour, was a structural masterpiece and a disaster waiting to happen. In Roman military engineering, there's a saying that survived in military manuals for centuries afterward. Never build a bridge you might need to cross while running. Maxentius had built exactly that bridge, positioned his entire army with their backs to it, and was about to discover that clever engineering features designed to kill the enemy work just as well at killing your own men when panic, rooting soldiers, and collapsing structural integrity converge in the same 30 seconds. The Tiber was waiting. And in less than 2 hours, it would claim more Roman lives than any battle since Cannae in 216 BC, when Hannibal had killed 50,000 legionaries in a single afternoon. Except this time, Romans wouldn't be dying from enemy action. They'd be drowning because their own emperor had built them a bridge designed to collapse. 8 a.m., October 28th. Constantine's army crested the final ridge 2 miles north of the Tiber and saw what they were facing. Maxentius's entire force deployed in battle formation on the northern bank, anchored between the Tiber on their right and rough terrain on their left, with Rome's walls visible behind them. The sight should have been devastating to morale. Maxentius commanded approximately 100,000 men, 70,000 infantry, 18,000 cavalry, and 10,000 Praetorian Guard, Rome's most elite troops who'd spent 3 centuries making and breaking emperors. His center was a wall of legionaries in full armor, carrying the rectangular scutum shields and gladius swords that had conquered the known world. His flanks were heavy cavalry, cataphracts in scale armor riding armored horses, the ancient world's equivalent of tanks. The Praetorian Guard held the position of honor on the right, nearest the Tiber, their black-crested helmets and purple cloaks marking them as the emperor's personal bodyguard. Constantine had 40,000 soldiers, of whom maybe 25,000 were infantry and 15,000 cavalry, many exhausted from the march across the Alps. some still recovering from wounds taken in earlier battles in northern Italy. The math was brutal. Constantine needed to kill 2.5 enemy soldiers for every one of his own just to break even. But Constantine had something Maxentius didn't. Soldiers who believed their god had promised them victory marked their shields with his symbol and were about to prove that faith is the most dangerous weapon in warfare when combined with competent generalship. Constantine halted his army at the ridgeline and assembled his senior commanders for what would be the shortest pre-battle council in Roman military history. The officers could see the same impossible mathematics he could. Maxentius's battle line stretched nearly 2 miles across the available ground, 3 ranks deep in places, a solid wall of shields and spears that looked impenetrable. Constantine's line, when fully deployed, would barely reach 1 mile, meaning Maxentius's flanks would extend beyond Constantine's on both sides, allowing envelopment attacks that could surround and annihilate the smaller force. Marcus Flavius, Constantine's cavalry commander, pointed at the enemy deployment and stated the obvious. If we fight them head-on, center against center, we lose through attrition in under 2 hours. They'll grind us down, then their cavalry wraps around our flanks, and it's over. Here's what the Roman military manuals said about fighting against superior numbers. Don't engage in a straight infantry clash, where the larger army's reserve depth wins through simple mathematics. Use terrain to negate numerical advantage. Use mobility to avoid being pinned down. Use tactical surprise to disrupt enemy formations before they can bring their full strength to bear. Constantine had studied those manuals. Every Roman officer had. But theory is easy when you're reading scrolls in a warm tent. Execution is terrifying when you're staring at 100,000 men who want to kill you, and the nearest defensible terrain is 50 miles behind you. Constantine made his decision in less than 5 minutes. He would deploy his infantry in the center, all 25,000 of them in tight formation, shields locked, designed to hold Maxentius's center in place through sheer stubborn defense. But the real striking power would come from his cavalry, 15,000 horsemen divided into 2 massive wings, 8,000 on the right flank under Flavius's direct command, 7,000 on the left under Tribune Crispus. The tactical plan was elegant and suicidal in equal measure. Pin Maxentius's center with infantry that couldn't win but wouldn't break. Then unleash cavalry charges against both flanks simultaneously, hoping to shatter the enemy wings before Maxentius's superior numbers could envelop Constantine's line. If the cavalry charges worked, Maxentius's army would collapse from the flanks inward. If they failed, Constantine's cavalry would be destroyed, his infantry surrounded, and the battle would end with 40,000 corpses and Constantine's head on a pike in Rome. The deployment took 90 minutes. Constantine's infantry formed up in the classic triplex aces, 3 lines of cohorts arranged in checkerboard pattern, allowing fresh troops to rotate forward as the front ranks tired. Each man carried a scutum shield painted with the Chi Rho symbol in white, a gladius sword, 2 pila javelins, and whatever faith they could muster that this Christian god Constantine kept invoking would actually protect them. The cavalry wings extended on both flanks, forming into wedge formations, the agmen quadratum tactical array that Roman cavalry had used for centuries, designed to concentrate maximum force at a single point and punch through enemy lines through sheer momentum. But here's what made Constantine's deployment revolutionary. He was treating cavalry as his primary strike force, not as support troops. Traditional Roman tactics for the last 600 years had been infantry-centric. Legionaries won battles through discipline, endurance, and close-quarters combat, while cavalry screened the flanks and pursued broken enemies. Constantine was inverting that doctrine, betting everything on mounted shock combat because he'd spent 6 years fighting Germanic tribes who taught him that heavy cavalry, used aggressively, could shatter infantry formations that thought themselves unbreakable. His 15,000 horsemen, many of them Gallic and Germanic warriors who'd grown up fighting on horseback, were about to face 18,000 of Maxentius's cataphracts in the largest cavalry engagement Italy had seen since the Civil Wars. At 9:30 a.m., Constantine rode along his front lines on a white horse, his shield emblazoned with the Chi Rho in gold leaf, clearly visible to every soldier in his army. The gesture was pure theater, the commander showing his troops he believed in the vision, that he was willing to fight under the same symbol he'd ordered them to paint on their shields. The soldiers cheered, not because they fully understood Christian theology or had converted in the night, but because Constantine had given them a narrative where their impossible situation became divine test rather than military suicide. Think about the psychological transformation. These men could see they were outnumbered catastrophically. They could calculate their survival odds were minimal. But Constantine had reframed the mathematics. They weren't just fighting Maxentius's army. They were fighting for a god who'd promised victory, and gods don't break promises. Across the field, Maxentius watched Constantine's deployment from his command position near the Praetorian Guard and felt vindicated. The fool was actually going to fight. No retreat, no desperate siege attempt, no guerrilla harassment. Constantine was deploying for open battle despite being outnumbered 2.5 to 1. Maxentius turned to his commanders and gave the order to advance. 70,000 infantry began marching forward in perfect formation, their hobnailed sandals creating a rhythmic thunder that could be heard for miles. The Sibylline prophecy had promised the enemy of Rome would die today. Maxentius watched Constantine's tiny army forming up to receive the charge, and assumed the prophecy meant those 40,000 men with crosses on their shields were about to be annihilated. By 10 a.m., both armies were within 400 yards of each other. Close enough to see individual faces, close enough to hear officers shouting orders in Latin on both sides, close enough that the psychological terror of impending combat was replacing tactical calculation with pure survival instinct. Constantine's infantry stood in formation, shields locked, waiting for the impact. His cavalry wings coiled on the flanks like springs under tension, ready to launch. Maxentius's massive line advanced steadily, confident in their numbers, their discipline, their emperor's divine mandate. The ground between the armies was open grassland that would become a slaughterhouse in the next 30 minutes. And both sides knew that when 140,000 Romans collided, the largest civil war battle since Philippi 354 years earlier, the killing would be so catastrophic that the Tiber would run red for days afterward. What neither side knew was that the battle's outcome wouldn't be decided by courage, discipline, or even tactical brilliance, but by the collapsing pontoon bridge waiting 200 yards downstream that would kill more men in 30 minutes than the entire day's combat combined. 8:30 a.m. As both armies prepared for battle, the most dangerous men on the field weren't the frontline legionaries or the cavalry. They were the 10,000 Praetorian Guards holding Maxentius's right flank. These weren't normal soldiers. The Praetorian Guard had been founded by Augustus in 27 BC as the emperor's personal bodyguard, stationed in Rome when regular legions were forbidden from entering the city. For 300 years, they'd protected emperors, murdered emperors, auctioned the imperial throne to the highest bidder, and effectively controlled who ruled Rome. They'd killed Caligula, elevated Claudius, murdered Pertinax, literally sold the empire at auction to Didius Julianus in 193 AD, and installed Maxentius himself in 306. They were paid triple what regular legionaries earned, lived in Rome instead of freezing on the frontier, and considered themselves the true power behind the throne. But here's what made them genuinely terrifying in battle. They were professional killers who trained for urban combat, palace coups, and close-quarters assassination. While frontier legions fought barbarians in open terrain, the Praetorians specialized in street fighting, rapid deployment, and the kind of brutal efficiency that comes from knowing your job is to kill Romans, not foreigners. Constantine's soldiers were marching toward 10,000 men who'd spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of killing other Romans. And those Praetorians had never lost a major battle, because they only fought when they knew they'd win. Today would be the exception. The Praetorian Guard's compensation told you everything about their true role in the empire. A regular legionary on the frontier earned 300 denarii per year, barely enough to survive between campaigns. A Praetorian Guardsman earned 1,000 denarii annually, plus bonuses that could triple that amount when a new emperor took power. Think about what that means. The men whose job was supposedly to protect the emperor made more money when emperors changed, creating a financial incentive to murder the very person they were sworn to defend. Between 193 AD and 285 AD, a period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, the Praetorian Guard had directly participated in the assassination or overthrow of at least 15 emperors. They weren't bodyguards. They were kingmakers with swords. And every emperor who took power knew his survival depended on keeping them wealthy, privileged, and satisfied. Their equipment reflected their elite status. While regular legionaries carried standard-issue gladius swords and scutum shields made from laminated wood, Praetorians wielded weapons forged by Rome's finest craftsmen. Gladi, with Damascus steel blades that held an edge through dozens of kills. Shields reinforced with bronze edging that could deflect strikes that would shatter normal shields. Their armor was lorica segmentata, articulated iron plates that provided better protection than chainmail while allowing full range of motion. Polished to a mirror shine and decorated with their unit emblems. They wore distinctive black-crested helmets and purple cloaks, the imperial color, marking them as extensions of the emperor's personal authority. You could spot a Praetorian from 200 yards away, and that visibility was intentional. They wanted everyone to know they were the emperor's chosen killers. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the Praetorians' combat effectiveness. They'd rarely fought in major field battles. Their expertise was urban warfare, fighting in the narrow streets of Rome, where their training in close-quarters combat and their knowledge of the city's layout made them nearly unbeatable. They'd suppressed dozens of riots, executed hundreds of political prisoners, and crushed several attempted coups. They were devastating in street fighting, palace assaults, and the kind of brutal efficiency required to murder an emperor surrounded by his personal guards. But open field combat against disciplined legions, that was different. That required the kind of sustained endurance, formation discipline, and willingness to die in ranks that frontier legions developed through years of fighting barbarian invasions. The Praetorians' commander at Milvian Bridge was Ruricius Pompeianus, a career guard officer who'd served for 23 years and had personally participated in installing 3 emperors, Diocletian in 284, Maximian in 286, and Maxentius in 306. Pompeianus understood the Guard's real strength wasn't military prowess. It was political survival. At 9 a.m., as both armies prepared to engage, Pompeianus positioned his 10,000 Praetorians on Maxentius's right flank, anchored against the Tiber River, in a defensive formation designed to hold ground rather than attack. The tactical positioning was textbook Roman doctrine. Protect the emperor's position, maintain formation integrity, wait for the center and left flank to break the enemy, then pursue fleeing troops. But Pompeianus had also quietly positioned his best cohort, 1,000 men from the 1st Praetorian cohort, the Guard's most elite unit, directly between Maxentius's command position and the Milvian Bridge. Officially, this was to protect the emperor's escape route if things went badly. Unofficially, Pompeianus was ensuring that if Maxentius lost, the Praetorian Guard would be positioned to retreat immediately while the rest of the army died, covering their withdrawal. Think about that calculation. The Praetorian Guard's institutional survival had depended for 3 centuries on one principle: back the winning side, and if you can't determine the winner beforehand, position yourself to survive either outcome. Pompeianus looked at Constantine's 40,000 exhausted soldiers facing Maxentius's 100,000 fresh troops and calculated the odds heavily favored Maxentius. But he also saw Constantine's fanatical morale, those chi-rho symbols on shields, the religious fervor in how Constantine's soldiers had advanced without hesitation, and recognized something dangerous. If Constantine somehow won despite impossible odds, the Praetorians needed to be able to negotiate their survival. That meant fighting hard enough to fulfill their obligation to Maxentius, but not so hard they destroyed their ability to surrender intact if the battle turned. At 9:30 a.m., Constantine's left-wing cavalry, 7,000 horsemen under Tribune Crispus, began their advance toward the Praetorian position. The Praetorians responded with practiced efficiency, forming into a defensive square, shields locked, spears angled outward at 45 degrees, creating a bristling wall that horses wouldn't charge into. It was the same formation infantry had used against cavalry for centuries. And it worked because horses are smart enough not to impale themselves on spears. Constantine's cavalry circled the Praetorian square, harassing with javelins, probing for gaps, but unable to break through the disciplined formation. For 30 minutes, the Praetorians held their ground without taking significant casualties, demonstrating exactly the kind of professional competence that had made them Rome's most feared urban combat force. But here's where professional competence collided with institutional self-preservation. Pompeianus could see that Maxentius's left flank was collapsing under Constantine's right-wing cavalry assault. Standard Roman doctrine said the Praetorians should break formation, counterattack Constantine's left cavalry from the side, relieve pressure on the collapsing flank, and turn the battle's momentum. Pompeianus had 10,000 fresh troops in perfect formation, and Constantine's left cavalry, exhausted from circling the Praetorian square, was vulnerable to a coordinated counterattack. One aggressive move could stabilize Maxentius's entire line. But counterattacking meant leaving their defensive position, exposing themselves to casualties, risking the Guard's ability to retreat intact if things deteriorated further. And the Praetorian Guard had learned through 3 centuries of political survival that emperors were expendable, but the Guard was eternal, as long as they lived to negotiate with the next emperor. Pompeianus made the decision that would haunt the Praetorian Guard's legacy forever. He held position. The Guard maintained their defensive square, protecting their sector perfectly, preventing Constantine's left cavalry from threatening Maxentius's command position, but doing absolutely nothing to help the rest of Maxentius's army, which was now collapsing on the left and center under Constantine's coordinated assault. At 11 a.m., as Maxentius's line began its general retreat toward the bridges, the Praetorian Guard was still in perfect formation, unbloodied, having fought exactly hard enough to claim they'd done their duty without risking the casualties that would prevent them from surviving Maxentius's defeat. 300 years of making and breaking emperors had taught them one final lesson. The emperor who dies in battle can't punish you, but the emperor who wins can reward your survival. And when Maxentius drowned in the Tiber 60 minutes later, the Praetorian Guard would be the first unit to throw down their weapons and surrender to Constantine, already calculating how much it would cost to buy their way into the new emperor's service. 9 a.m. While Maxentius's infantry held the center in traditional Roman fashion, Constantine was deploying his army with one critical difference. He was putting his cavalry in the decisive positions. This was revolutionary. Traditional Roman tactics treated cavalry as support troops, useful for scouting, harassment, and pursuing broken enemies, but never as the primary strike force. Infantry won Roman battles. The legion, disciplined, armored, fighting in tight formation with shields locked, had dominated Mediterranean warfare for 600 years. But Constantine had spent the last 6 years fighting Germanic tribes along the Rhine, and he'd learned something Roman generals in Italy had forgotten. Heavy cavalry, used aggressively, could shatter infantry formations that thought themselves unbreakable. Constantine commanded approximately 15,000 cavalry, many of them Gallic and Germanic horsemen who'd spent their lives training to fight on horseback, wearing scale armor and wielding long spears designed to punch through shield walls. These weren't Roman cavalry. They were tribal warriors who'd learned to fight mounted before they could walk, and Constantine had integrated them into his army as shock troops. His tactical plan was simple and brutal. Pin Maxentius's center with infantry, then unleash his cavalry against the flanks in overwhelming charges designed to roll up the enemy line from the sides. If it worked, Maxentius's numerical advantage would become a liability as his packed formations became trapped and unable to maneuver. If it failed, Constantine's outnumbered infantry would be surrounded and slaughtered. There was no middle ground. Constantine's cavalry composition told the story of his 6 years commanding the Rhine frontier. Approximately 8,000 horsemen were Gallic warriors, Celts from territories Rome had conquered centuries earlier, but who'd maintained their warrior culture and horsemanship traditions. These men rode smaller, faster horses than Roman cavalry, bred for endurance and agility rather than the massive destriers knights would later use in medieval warfare. They wore scale armor, thousands of small metal plates sewn onto leather backing, providing flexibility and protection that was lighter than Roman lorica segmentata, but nearly as effective against slashing weapons. Their primary weapon was the contos, a 12-foot lance made from ash wood with an iron tip, wielded two-handed while controlling the horse with knee pressure alone. Think about the skill that required. You're galloping at 20 miles per hour, holding a 12-foot spear with both hands, steering a 200-pound animal with your legs, and trying to hit a target protected by shields and armor. It took a lifetime of training, which is exactly what these Gallic horsemen had. The remaining 7,000 cavalry were Germanic warriors, Franks and Alemanni, who'd been fighting Rome for generations before Constantine recruited them as foederati, allied troops who served in exchange for land grants and Roman citizenship. These warriors were even more terrifying than the Gauls because they'd grown up in a culture where mounted warfare was the primary military tradition. Germanic tribes didn't build cities, didn't fight in formation, didn't have professional standing armies. They had warriors who lived on horseback, raided on horseback, and considered dismounting in battle to be cowardly. Constantine had integrated these tribal raiders into his army by offering them something their traditional lifestyle couldn't provide: consistent pay, professional equipment, and the opportunity to fight for an empire instead of against it. By 312 AD, these Germanic horsemen had been serving under Constantine for 3 to 6 years, long enough to understand Roman tactical doctrine while maintaining their native aggression and mounted combat expertise. Here's what made Constantine's cavalry doctrine revolutionary. He was using them as breakthrough weapons, not as support troops. Traditional Roman cavalry tactics since the Republic had been defensive: screen the infantry flanks, prevent enemy cavalry from surrounding the legions, pursue routing enemies after the infantry won the battle. Constantine's Rhine frontier experience had taught him that aggressive cavalry charges into infantry flanks could collapse formations before the infantry even engaged. He'd watched Germanic tribal warriors punch through Roman legionary lines by concentrating hundreds of horsemen at a single weak point, creating breaches that turned organized formations into panicked mobs. Now he was applying those barbarian tactics with Roman discipline and coordination. Directing 8,000 cavalry at specific target points, timing charges to hit simultaneously with infantry pressure from the front, using weight and momentum to physically bowl over infantry who were braced for frontal assault but vulnerable to flank attacks. The tactical mathematics were brutal but elegant. A horse and rider together weigh approximately 1,400 pounds. At full gallop, 20 miles per hour, that mass generates roughly 4,000 pounds of kinetic force at impact. A Roman legionary in formation, braced with his shield locked against his neighbors, can absorb maybe 1,500 pounds of frontal force before being knocked backward. But when cavalry hits from the side, perpendicular to the shield, lines orientation, the legionary's shield doesn't protect him, his armor doesn't help, and his formation discipline becomes a liability because he can't turn to face the threat without breaking the shield wall that's protecting everyone else. Constantine's cavalry charges were designed to exploit exactly this vulnerability. Hit infantry formations from angles they couldn't defend while maintaining frontline pressure that prevented them from rotating their lines. At 9:30 a.m., Constantine personally briefed his cavalry commanders on the attack sequence. Marcus Flavius would lead the right wing, 8,000 Gallic horsemen targeting Maxentius's left flank, where the terrain was more open and favorable for mounted maneuver. Tribune Crispus commanded the left wing, 7,000 Germanic warriors assigned to engage the Praetorian Guard, not to break them, but to pin them in position and prevent them from reinforcing Maxentius's collapsing flanks. The timing would be critical. Constantine's infantry would advance first, engaging Maxentius's center and drawing his attention and reserves forward. Once the infantry lines were locked in combat, shields clashing, gladies stabbing, both sides committed to the frontal grind, the cavalry would launch from both flanks simultaneously. The infantry would hold Maxentius's center like an anvil, while the cavalry hammered both flanks, creating a double envelopment that would trap 70,000 enemy soldiers between three directions of attack. But here's where Constantine's plan required something Roman military doctrine had never emphasized: perfect timing. If the cavalry charged too early, before the infantry had fixed Maxentius's center in place, the enemy could disengage, refuse their flanks, and reorient to meet the cavalry charges frontally where their shield walls would be effective. If the cavalry charged too late, after Constantine's outnumbered infantry had already been ground down by Maxentius's superior numbers, there wouldn't be enough pressure on the enemy center to prevent them from turning to face the flank attacks. The window for effective cavalry impact was maybe 15 minutes. The period after the infantry locked in melee combat, but before casualties and exhaustion degraded Constantine's infantry cohesion beyond recovery. Constantine deployed signal riders, mounted messengers positioned to carry orders from his command position to the cavalry wings in under 2 minutes. This was improvised battlefield communication technology, developed on the Rhine frontier where coordinating attacks across broken terrain required something faster than runners on foot. The system was simple. Constantine would send a rider to each wing with a colored pennant. Red meant advance and engage. Green meant hold position. Black meant retreat immediately. At 10 a.m., as his infantry began their advance toward Maxentius's center, Constantine held 2 red pennants in his hands, waiting for the precise moment when Maxentius's formations would be most vulnerable to cavalry shock. Maxentius, watching from his command position near the Praetorian Guard, saw Constantine's cavalry wings deploying on both flanks and assumed they were following traditional Roman doctrine, screening the infantry, preparing to pursue after the center battle was won. He'd positioned his own 18,000 cataphractic cavalry to counter Constantine's mounted forces, matching cavalry against cavalry in the classic tactical response. What Maxentius didn't understand, what no Roman general fighting in Italy had experienced in generations, was that Constantine's cavalry weren't there to fight other cavalry. They were there to destroy infantry. And in the next 90 minutes, those 15,000 horsemen would demonstrate that the age of the legion as the decisive weapon in Mediterranean warfare was ending, replaced by mounted shock troops who could break formations that had resisted barbarian invasions for 6 centuries. The only question was whether Constantine could time the charges perfectly enough to shatter Maxentius's flanks before his own outnumbered center collapsed under the weight of 70,000 legionaries who believed they were fighting for an emperor who the gods themselves had promised would win. 10 a.m. The battle began not with a dramatic cavalry charge, but with something far more terrifying. The systematic advance of 70,000 armored men, closing the distance between 2 armies that both believed God wanted them to win. Constantine's infantry, 25,000 men with Chi Rho symbols painted on their shields, marched forward in disciplined formation, maintaining spacing, shields locked, advancing at the measured pace Roman legions had used for centuries. Maxentius's center, 40,000 legionaries loyal to the old gods and the old ways, advanced to meet them with equal discipline. The sound of 95,000 men in armor moving across open ground was like continuous thunder. The clank of metal on metal, the rhythmic crash of hobnailed boots, the shouts of officers maintaining formation, the war cries from both sides, invoking gods who supposedly controlled the outcome. At 200 yards, both armies were jogging. At 100 yards, running. At 50 yards, the front ranks lowered their pila, the Roman throwing spears designed to punch through shields and armor, and hurled them in unison. 10,000 iron-tipped javelins arced through the air from both sides, crossing in flight like lethal rain. The pila struck with devastating effect. Shields splintered, men screamed, soldiers in the front ranks collapsed with spears through their chests. But the formations didn't break. This was what Roman military training produced. Men who maintained discipline even as their friends died beside them, who stepped over corpses to close the gaps, who locked shields and prepared to kill at arm's length because that's what the legion demanded. At 10:15 a.m., 95,000 Romans collided in the largest civil war battle since Philippi in 42 BC, and the killing began in earnest. The physics of Roman close-quarters combat was brutal mathematics played out in blood. Each legionary carried a scutum shield, 4 feet tall, 2.5 feet wide, curved to wrap around the body, weighing 16 pounds of laminated wood, covered in leather and reinforced with iron edging. When formations collided, the shields hit first, 95,000 pounds of wood and metal crashing together with the combined momentum of men running at 8 miles per hour. The impact was devastating. Soldiers in the front ranks were crushed between their own shields and the men behind them who couldn't stop their forward momentum. Ribs cracked, arms broke. Men suffocated standing upright, crushed in the press of bodies. Those who survived the initial collision immediately began the killing dance Roman soldiers had trained for since childhood. Stab with the gladius over the top of your shield, aiming for the throat or face. If that's blocked, punch with the shield boss, the iron center reinforcement designed to break noses and teeth. If the enemy staggers, step forward into the gap and stab again, this time into the armpit or groin where armor doesn't protect. Kill, step forward, lock shields with the man beside you, repeat until the enemy breaks or you die. Here's what made this clash genuinely insane. Both sides were using identical tactics, identical equipment, identical training. Roman versus Roman, legion against legion. The same military system that had conquered the Mediterranean now turned inward to devour itself. The only tactical difference was psychological. Constantine's men believed they were fighting for a god who'd promised victory through a vision, while Maxentius's soldiers fought for an emperor who'd promised victory through a prophecy. Faith versus faith. Each side convinced divine forces guaranteed their triumph, neither willing to break because breaking meant betraying their god. The casualty rate in the first 15 minutes was catastrophic. Approximately 2,000 men from both sides died in the initial collision, crushed, stabbed, trampled, suffocating in the press of bodies. Think about that. 2,000 dead in a quarter hour, and the battle had barely started. The front ranks were replaced every 3 to 5 minutes as exhaustion, wounds, or death took men out of the line. Roman tactical doctrine called for rotating fresh troops forward from the second and third ranks, allowing the exhausted frontline soldiers to fall back, rest, and return when their breath recovered. But at Milvian Bridge, the casualty rate was so high that replacements were filling gaps left by corpses, not by tired soldiers stepping back. The rotation system designed for endurance was now a conveyor belt feeding men into a meat grinder. At 10:30 a.m., Constantine's center was starting to buckle. The math was inescapable. 25,000 men fighting 40,000 couldn't hold forever, regardless of morale or divine symbols painted on shields. Maxentius's superior numbers meant he could replace casualties faster, rotate fresh troops more frequently, and maintain pressure that was slowly compressing Constantine's line. The front ranks of Constantine's infantry were being pushed backward, not breaking, not routing, but giving ground incrementally as men died faster than they could be replaced. Officers were screaming at their troops to hold formation, to trust in the Chai Row, to believe Constantine's god would save them. But gods don't stop gladius blades, and faith doesn't regenerate casualties. Constantine watched his center compressing from his command position 300 yards behind the lines and made a calculation that would decide the battle. He had maybe 20 minutes before his infantry line collapsed entirely. If Maxentius's center broke through, the battle was over. Constantine's army would be split in half, surrounded and annihilated. The cavalry charges had to happen now, before his infantry cohesion shattered completely. He turned to his signal riders and handed them the red pennants. Tell Flavius and Crispus, charge immediately. Full assault on both flanks. If they don't break Maxentius's wings in the next 30 minutes, we're all dead. The riders galloped toward both cavalry wings, pennants streaming behind them. At 10:35 a.m., Marcus Flavius received the order on Constantine's right flank and immediately began forming his 8,000 Gallic cavalry into attack formation. The wedge, the kunais in Roman tactical terminology, was simple geometry applied to mass violence. Put your heaviest riders and best armored horses at the point of the triangle. Pack the rest of the cavalry behind them in tight formation, each rank slightly wider than the one in front. When the wedge hits an infantry line, all 8,000 riders' momentum is concentrated at a single point, approximately 10 yards wide, generating enough force to physically blast through shield walls that would stop individual riders. The Romans had been using cavalry wedges for centuries, but never with this level of coordination or at this scale. 8,000 horsemen formed into a single massive arrowhead, aimed at Maxentius's left flank. At 10:40 a.m., Flavius raised his spatha, the longer cavalry sword, and screamed the order that would change the battle's momentum. For Constantine, for Christ, charge! 8,000 Gallic horsemen spurred their mounts from standstill to full gallop in under 10 seconds. The wedge accelerating across the 400 yards, separating them from Maxentius's left flank like a battering ram made of muscle, armor, and desperation. The sound was apocalyptic. hoofbeats merging into continuous thunder, warriors screaming war cries in Gallic and Latin, horses neighing as they hurtled toward the collision. Maxentius's left flank, approximately 12,000 infantry in tight formation, shields locked, braced for cavalry assault, watched the wedge coming and understood with crystallizing horror that Roman military doctrine had no effective counter for this level of mounted aggression. You couldn't dodge 8,000 horses. You couldn't outrun them. You could only lock shields, brace your spears, and pray that mass and discipline would stop momentum and desperation. At 10:42 a.m., the cavalry wedge hit Maxentius's left flank with the force of a collapsing building. The front three ranks of infantry, approximately 900 men, were simply obliterated. Horses crashed into the shield wall at full gallop, their combined weight and speed physically lifting legionaries off their feet and throwing them backward into the men behind them. Lances punched through shields, through armor, through bodies, some spears passing completely through one soldier and wounding the man behind him. The cavalry wedge drove 20 yards deep into Maxentius's formation before momentum finally stopped. And then the real killing began. 8,000 horsemen trapped inside an infantry formation, fighting with swords and axes at close quarters, surrounded by legionaries who were trying to pull riders from their mounts while dodging hooves that could cave in a man's skull with a single kick. This wasn't battle. It was a brawl between 20,000 men packed into a space designed for maybe 5,000. And the casualty rate on both sides was approaching 100 deaths per minute. In the next 15 minutes, Flavius's cavalry charge would either shatter Maxentius's left flank completely or be absorbed and destroyed by sheer numbers. And 400 yards away, Constantine's center was still being pushed backward, his infantry dying at a rate that would collapse his line in less than 20 minutes. Everything now depended on whether mounted shock could break infantry cohesion faster than numerical superiority could grind down desperate defenders. 10:30 a.m., the infantry clash at Milvian Bridge was everything Constantine's officers had feared. A grinding, brutal stalemate where superior numbers mattered more than superior faith. Maxentius's center, with 40,000 men packed into tight formation, was simply too deep for Constantine's 25,000 to break through. Roman legion tactics were designed for exactly this kind of fighting. The front rank stabbed with gladius swords over the top of locked shields, aiming for throats, faces, and the gaps in armor. When men in the front fell from exhaustion, wounds, or death, the second rank stepped forward to replace them, maintaining the shield wall's integrity. Both armies were using identical tactics, identical equipment, identical training. The only variables were numbers and morale. Maxentius had the numbers. Constantine's men had the chi rho on their shields and a conviction that God had promised them victory. For 30 minutes, that conviction held against mathematics. But the casualties were catastrophic. Constantine's front ranks were taking losses at a 2-on-1 ratio. For every Maxentian soldier who fell, 2 of Constantine's men died, simply because Maxentius could replace casualties faster from his deeper reserves. By 11 a.m., Constantine's center was starting to buckle, the shield wall developing gaps, officers screaming at their men to hold formation even as they watched the line compress under pressure. If the center broke, Maxentius's cavalry would charge through the gap and slaughter Constantine's army from behind. Constantine needed his flanking cavalry to do something catastrophic to Maxentius's line. And he needed it in the next 10 minutes, or the battle and his entire campaign was over. The combat itself was industrial-scale butchery conducted at sword's length. Roman gladius blades, 18 inches of steel designed for stabbing rather than slashing, found gaps in armor with mechanical efficiency. A thrust over the shield rim caught a Maxentian soldier in the throat, severing his carotid artery. He collapsed, blood spraying across the men beside him, and a Constantine legionary stepped forward into the gap, only to take a gladius through his eye socket from a counter-thrust. Both men dead in under 3 seconds, their bodies trampled into the mud as the lines compressed further. Multiply that exchange by thousands, happening simultaneously across a battle line stretching 800 yards, and you begin to understand the arithmetic of annihilation. By 10:45 a.m., the ground between the two armies was carpeted with bodies, some dead, some dying, some merely wounded, but unable to crawl away through the press of armored boots that crushed them into the blood-soaked earth. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the psychological breaking point in Roman infantry combat. It wasn't the casualties that shattered formations. It was the realization that dying accomplished nothing. Constantine's soldiers could see they were being pushed backward despite killing Maxentians at a respectable rate. Every step they gave ground, Maxentius's superior numbers allowed him to compress his formation tighter, bringing more men into contact with Constantine's shrinking front. The mathematics were inescapable. Constantine had started the battle with 25,000 infantry in his center, deployed in 3 lines, approximately 8 ranks deep. By 11 a.m., casualties had reduced that to maybe 21,000 effectives, 4,000 dead or 2 wounded to fight. And the survivors were now compressed into formations 10 ranks deep, because the front line had physically shortened as men died. Think about what that means. Constantine's infantry was becoming denser, more packed together, easier to kill with each gladius thrust, because there was less room to dodge or maneuver. Maxentius's center, by contrast, was still operating at designed capacity. He'd started with 40,000 men in his center, deployed in formations 12 ranks deep. Casualties had cost him approximately 3,000 killed, a lower absolute number than Constantine's losses despite facing the same combat intensity, simply because Maxentius could rotate fresh troops more frequently from his deeper reserves. His remaining 37,000 men were maintaining their formation integrity, pressure constant, replacement rate sustainable. The centurions commanding Maxentius's center could smell victory, not through tactical brilliance, just through patient attrition. Keep stabbing, keep pushing, keep feeding fresh men into the front ranks. Constantine's line would collapse eventually because mathematics said it had to. At 10:50 a.m., Constantine's center developed its first serious gap, a 20-yard section where casualties had been so concentrated that there weren't enough men left to maintain the shield wall. Officers screamed at nearby cohorts to extend their lines and cover the breach. But extending meant thinning other sections, creating new vulnerabilities. Maxentius's centurions saw the gap forming and immediately concentrated their pressure there, pushing forward like water finding a crack in a dam. If they could widen that gap to 50 yards, Maxentius's cavalry, which had been waiting behind the infantry for exactly this opportunity, could charge through and attack Constantine's center from behind, rolling up the formation and turning organized resistance into panicked rout. But here's where Constantine's Rhine frontier experience manifested in ways Maxentius couldn't anticipate. Constantine had trained his centurions to fight independently when formations broke down. Germanic tribal warfare didn't follow Roman rules. There were no neat lines, no predictable rotations, just chaotic melee where small unit leadership made the difference between survival and annihilation. Constantine's officers, many of whom had spent years fighting Franks and Alemanni, knew how to reorganize broken formations under pressure. The gap in Constantine's line, which should have been catastrophic, was immediately filled by a reserve cohort that Constantine had positioned 100 yards behind the front, specifically for crisis moments like this. 500 men double-timed forward, shields locked, and slammed into the breach like a cork jamming a bottle. stopping Maxentius's breakthrough before it could widen. The reserve cohort's intervention bought Constantine maybe 10 minutes, but it cost him his last tactical reserve. He had no more fresh troops to commit. Every man in his infantry was now engaged, fighting in the front lines, holding breaches, or too wounded to contribute. At 11 a.m., one of Constantine's senior centurions, a veteran named Gaius Scribonius, who'd served under Constantine's father and fought in 20 major battles, fought his way back from the front line to Constantine's command position, his armor dented and splattered with blood. His report was brutally concise. "We've lost 5,000 dead, another 2,000 too wounded to fight. The line is holding but compressing. We can last maybe 20 more minutes before cohesion fails completely. If your cavalry doesn't break their flanks in the next quarter hour, we're finished." Constantine looked at the battle unfolding before him and made a calculation that would haunt military historians for centuries. He had no reserves left to commit. His center was collapsing incrementally, and his only hope was that Flavius's cavalry charge on the right flank would shatter Maxentius's left before Maxentius's center shattered Constantine's infantry. Everything now depended on 8,000 horsemen doing what Roman cavalry had almost never accomplished, destroying infantry formations through shock combat alone, without infantry support, against an enemy that outnumbered them and had spent 600 years perfecting anti-cavalry tactics. At 11:05 a.m., Constantine received the first report from Flavius's cavalry assault on Maxentius's left flank. The cavalry wedge had penetrated 20 yards deep into enemy formations and was locked in brutal close-quarters combat with approximately 12,000 Maxentian infantry. Casualties on both sides were catastrophic. Flavius had lost perhaps 2,500 horsemen in the first 5 minutes of contact, killed or dismounted and overwhelmed by legionaries dragging riders from their mounts. But, and this was the crucial detail, Maxentius's left flank was no longer advancing. The cavalry charge hadn't broken the formation yet, but it had stopped its forward momentum, forcing thousands of Maxentian soldiers to turn and face the cavalry threat instead of continuing to compress Constantine's center. That shift in Maxentius's tactical focus, diverting troops to contain the cavalry penetration instead of exploiting the collapsing gap in Constantine's center, bought Constantine's infantry the 10 minutes they needed to stabilize. The pressure on the center eased fractionally as Maxentius redirected 5,000 troops from his center reserves to shore up his threatened left flank. Constantine's centurions felt the compression slow, felt the killing rate decrease slightly, felt hope returning that maybe, they could hold long enough for the cavalry to accomplish something decisive. But here's the brutal reality Constantine couldn't see from his command position. Flavius's cavalry were dying at a rate that would exhaust their combat effectiveness within 20 minutes. Mounted combat inside an infantry formation is suicide mathematics. Horses tire faster than men. Riders can't maintain balance when surrounded. And a cavalry charge that doesn't break through in the first 5 minutes typically gets absorbed and destroyed by infantry who've recovered from the initial shock. Flavius had 20 yards of penetration and 6,500 surviving horsemen trapped in a killing zone surrounded by 10,000 infantry who were systematically dragging riders down and stabbing them to death. The cavalry charge was buying time for Constantine's center, but it was buying that time with Gallic blood, and the payment rate was unsustainable. In 15 minutes, either Maxentius's left flank would collapse completely, or Flavius's cavalry would be annihilated. And when the cavalry died, Constantine's center, already exhausted, depleted, held together by discipline and desperation, would have nothing left to stop Maxentius's 35,000 remaining infantry from crushing them into the Tiber. 10:45 a.m. While Constantine's infantry was being ground down in the center, his cavalry commanders, veterans who'd spent years fighting Germanic tribes along the Rhine, launched the attack that would decide the battle. Constantine had positioned 8,000 heavy cavalry on his right flank, opposite Maxentius's left, where the terrain was more open and suitable for mounted warfare. These weren't the light cavalry Rome traditionally used for scouting. These were Gallic and Germanic horsemen in scale armor, wielding 12-foot lances called contos, riding horses trained to crash into infantry formations rather than shy away. At 10:45, they charged. The formation was a wedge, cavalry packed tightly with the strongest riders and best armored horses at the point, designed to punch through shield walls through sheer momentum and concentrated force. The charge hit Maxentius's left flank at full gallop, approximately 20 miles per hour, with 8,000 horses and riders weighing a combined 8 million pounds, slamming into a line of infantry who'd never faced heavy cavalry tactics like this. The physics were devastating. The front rank of Maxentian infantry, men holding shields and braced for impact, were simply bowled over, trampled, or impaled on 12-foot lances that punched through their shields before they could react. The cavalry wedge drove 15 yards deep into the formation before momentum stopped. But that 15-yard penetration was enough. Maxentius's left flank suddenly facing armored horsemen fighting from above, while their own formation was disrupted, began to fall apart. Men in the second and third ranks, watching their comrades being trampled and speared, started backing away. Officers screamed at them to hold, to maintain formation. But panic is contagious in battle, and the moment one man runs, others follow. The initial impact killed approximately 600 Maxentian soldiers in under 30 seconds. The front three ranks of infantry literally crushed or impaled by the weight of 8,000 horses hitting at full speed. Think about what that looks like. A 12-foot Contos lance, wielded by a rider moving at 20 miles per hour, generates enough force to punch through a scutum shield, through the lorica segmentata armor behind it, through the man's torso, and out his back. Some lances impaled 2 men before breaking. Horses trained for shock combat, not the docile mounts cavalry traditionally rode, crashed into the shield wall like battering rams, their combined weight and momentum physically lifting legionaries off their feet and throwing them backward into the men behind them. The sound was apocalyptic. Wood splintering, metal shrieking, horses screaming, men dying. And it didn't stop. The cavalry wedge kept driving forward, the point of the formation, punching deeper while the widening base crushed everything on either side. Here's what made Flavius's charge tactically revolutionary. He didn't stop after the initial penetration. Traditional cavalry doctrine said you hit the enemy, cause disruption, then withdraw to regroup. Flavius understood from Germanic warfare that stopping inside an infantry formation meant death. You'd be surrounded, dismounted, overwhelmed. So his cavalry kept moving forward, using momentum to carry them completely through Maxentius's formation. The wedge became a spear driving through Maxentius's left flank, creating a corridor of destruction 20 yards wide and 70 yards deep, as 8,000 horsemen carved through approximately 12,000 infantry deployed in a stationary defensive position. But here's where the casualties became catastrophic for Maxentius. The panic spread faster than the actual cavalry penetration. Soldiers in the 4th, 5th, and 6th ranks, men who hadn't even been hit yet, watched the front ranks disintegrate and made the rational calculation that standing in formation meant being trampled next. They broke. Not all at once, but in clusters of 50 and 100, men turning and running south toward the Tiber bridges. By 10:50 a.m., Maxentius's left flank wasn't just disrupted, it was dissolving, the formation fragmenting into isolated clusters surrounded by routing comrades. Flavius saw the enemy formation coming apart and immediately signaled his reserve cavalry 2,000 riders he'd held back, to wheel left and attack the routing infantry from the side. This was textbook exploitation. You don't chase individual fleeing soldiers, you position cavalry to block retreat routes and force them into killing zones. The reserve cavalry cut off Maxentius's routing left flank from the bridges, driving them toward rough terrain where cavalry could run down infantry without the fleeing soldiers having anywhere to hide. The slaughter that followed was systematic and brutal. Cavalry killing infantry who've broken formation isn't combat, it's hunting. A horse runs 3 times faster than a man in armor. A rider with a spatha sword sits 4 feet higher than a running soldier, giving him leverage and reach the fleeing man can't counter. Flavius's cavalry pursued Maxentius's routing left flank for 15 minutes, cutting down soldiers from behind with downward sword strokes that split skulls and severed necks. Approximately 4,000 Maxentian soldiers died in the rout, killed while their backs were turned and their weapons sheathed because panic had overridden military discipline. By 11 a.m., Maxentius's left flank had ceased to exist as a combat formation. Of the original 12,000 infantry, approximately 5,000 were dead, 600 killed in the initial cavalry impact, 500 killed in the melee fighting, 4,000 cut down during the rout. 3,000 more were fleeing south in complete disorder. The remaining 4,000 had been cut off and were trapped in rough terrain where Flavius's cavalry was systematically forcing them to surrender or die. The psychological impact of watching 12,000 men collapse in 15 minutes rippled across Maxentius's entire army. His center, the 40,000 infantry grinding down Constantine's 25,000, could see their left flank disintegrating. Officers started diverting troops to shore up the collapse, pulling 5,000 men from formations engaged with Constantine's infantry. That diversion was exactly what Constantine's battle plan required. The pressure on his center eased as Maxentius's commanders panicked and shifted forces to defend against the cavalry breakthrough. Maxentius, watching from his command position near the Praetorian Guard, made the decision that would seal his fate. He ordered his reserve cavalry, approximately 8,000 cataphracts, to counterattack Flavius's cavalry and restore the flank. It was the correct tactical response. But those 8,000 cavalry were Maxentius's last mobile reserve, the only force he could use to exploit a breakthrough or cover a retreat if things went catastrophically wrong. By committing them to stop Flavius's rampage, Maxentius was betting everything on stopping the cavalry penetration before it could roll up his entire line. At 11:05 a.m., 8,000 Maxentian cataphracts charged into Flavius's 8,000 Gallic horsemen. What happened next was the largest cavalry versus cavalry engagement in a Roman civil war since Pharsalus in 48 BC. 16,000 horsemen collided in open ground, and the killing became personal, savage, and utterly decisive. The fight would last 20 minutes and cost both sides approximately 5,000 combined casualties. And while those cavalry were locked in their private war, Constantine's battered center, no longer facing the full weight of Maxentius's 40,000 infantry, would finally stop retreating and begin pushing forward. 11 a.m. On Maxentius's right flank, the Praetorian Guard, 10,000 elite troops who'd never lost a major battle, made a decision that would haunt their legacy forever. They held their position instead of counterattacking. Constantine's left flank cavalry had attempted a charge against the Praetorians, but the Guard had formed a defensive hedgehog, shields locked and spears angled outward, creating a wall that horses wouldn't charge into. Constantine's cavalry stalled 30 yards from the Praetorian line, unable to break through. But here's where military professionalism collided with institutional self-preservation. The Praetorian commanders could see that Maxentius's left flank was collapsing, Standard Roman tactics said counterattack immediately. Use your intact formation to hit Constantine's cavalry from the side. Relieve pressure on your collapsing flank. But counterattacking meant leaving their defensive position, exposing themselves, risking casualties. And the Praetorian Guard had spent 300 years learning one critical lesson. Emperors come and go. But the Guard survives by never taking unnecessary risks. If Maxentius lost this battle, the Praetorians wanted to be intact enough to negotiate with Constantine. So they held. They maintained their formation and watched Maxentius's army collapse while they stood ready to retreat to Rome. Ruricius Pompeianus, the Praetorian commander, watched the battle with the calculated detachment of a man who'd survived 3 regime changes. At 11:05 a.m., one of his tribunes rode up and shouted, "Commander, Maxentius's left is collapsing. If we attack Constantine's right cavalry from their exposed flank, we can trap them and save the battle." Pompeianus saw exactly what the tribune described, a textbook opportunity for a devastating counterattack. But Pompeianus also saw something the young tribune didn't. The Praetorian Guard's survival mattered more than Maxentius's victory. He'd watched emperors die for 3 decades. The throne was a revolving door lubricated with blood, and the only institution that survived was the Praetorian Guard, because they'd learned to calculate survival odds faster than loyalty. Pompeianus turned to the tribune. "Maintain defensive formation. No counterattack. We protect our position and wait for Maxentius's orders." Think about the tactical mathematics. A Praetorian counterattack at 11 a.m. would have engaged Constantine's 8,000 cavalry, with 10,000 elite infantry moving in tight formation. Infantry in disciplined formation with interlocking shields and spear support massacres cavalry that can't maneuver. This was basic Roman tactical doctrine that had won wars for centuries. Constantine's cavalry would have been forced into an impossible choice: retreat and abandon the slaughter of Maxentius's collapsing left flank, or stand and fight against professional infantry in conditions that heavily favored shields and spears over mounted warfare. Either outcome would have stabilized Maxentius's fragmenting left and bought precious time for his center to break through Constantine's outnumbered infantry line. One aggressive move by the Praetorian Guard, and the battle was salvageable. But Pompeianus had watched Constantine's soldiers fight like men who believed they couldn't lose. He'd observed the tactical coordination, witnessed the Rhine frontier veterans who'd adapted brilliantly to battlefield chaos. If Constantine's soldiers believed God had promised them victory, and they were winning despite facing catastrophic numerical disadvantages, betting against them by dying for Maxentius seemed like poor risk management for a commander who'd survived by reading political winds. At 11:15 a.m., Maxentius himself rode to the Praetorian position, his imperial purple cloak streaming behind him. "Pompeianus, your guard will advance immediately. Hit Constantine's right cavalry from the flank. That's a direct order from your emperor." Pompeianus saluted and responded with carefully chosen words that condemned Maxentius to death. "Augustus, my forces are currently engaged in defensive operations. If we abandon our position, Constantine's left cavalry will attack our formation from behind. We'll be surrounded and destroyed. I respectfully request permission to maintain defensive posture." Both men understood the unspoken truth. The Praetorian Guard was preparing to survive Maxentius's defeat, not prevent it. Maxentius wheeled his horse and galloped back toward his disintegrating center, leaving the Guard in their perfect defensive formation, unbloodied, intact, and strategically useless. Here's what the Christian chronicles tried to erase. The Battle of Milvian Bridge wasn't won by divine intervention. It was lost by institutional betrayal. The Praetorian Guard's refusal to counterattack meant Constantine faced only 60,000 effective troops instead of 70,000. By noon, the Guard would surrender without fighting, already negotiating with Constantine's officers. The next morning, Constantine would order every Praetorian executed and the Guard disbanded forever. Constantine's infantry, sensing disruption in Maxentius's center, surged forward with renewed aggression. Maxentius's soldiers found themselves fighting in two directions simultaneously. Gladius stabbing forward at Constantine's infantry while watching cavalry attack from their left side. The formation began to fragment. By 11:25 a.m., Maxentius's center had broken into three distinct groups fighting independently. At 11:30 a.m., Constantine's infantry, who'd been on the defensive for 90 minutes, absorbing casualties at a 2-1 ratio, suddenly found themselves advancing. Maxentius's center had hit 25% casualties and was fragmenting into isolated groups. Maxentius, watching from his command position, made his final decision: general retreat to the bridges. At 11:32 a.m., he ordered the signal horns blown, 3 sharp blasts. But the bridges could handle maybe 1,000 men at a time in organized columns. Maxentius had 50,000 panicked soldiers who all understood the horns to mean run for the bridges. What should have been an organized fighting withdrawal became a stampede. 20,000 soldiers immediately broke and ran for the Tiber crossings. Constantine's cavalry switched to pursuit mode, the most lethal phase of ancient warfare, where cavalry runs down fleeing infantry like wolves chasing sheep. 20,000 soldiers fled toward the Tiber. 15,000 chose the pontoon bridge, designed with a collapsible center section to trap Constantine's army. As thousands of armored soldiers ran across, their combined weight stressed the structure beyond its limits. At 11:52 a.m., the center section collapsed, dropping 3,000 soldiers into the Tiber, while 12,000 were stranded on the north bank. Roman armor weighed 60 pounds. A soldier in full armor who falls into deep water sinks like a stone. The 3,000 men drowned within minutes. Drowning in Roman armor. You sink immediately because 60 pounds of iron doesn't float. The lorica segmentata restricts your arm movement. The leather straps are wet, swollen, impossible to unbuckle underwater while panicking. Your helmet fills with water. You thrash, scream, filling your lungs with river water, and sink. Death takes 3 to 5 minutes. Long enough to understand you're dying, short enough that no one can save you. The 12,000 stranded soldiers had nowhere to go. At 11:55 a.m., 8,000 surrendered, the largest mass capitulation in a Roman civil war since Pharsalus. The remaining 4,000 were cut down by cavalry. The pontoon bridge disaster killed or captured 14,000 soldiers in 10 minutes, more than Constantine's entire cavalry force had killed in 2 hours. Maxentius himself was caught in the retreat. Wearing full imperial regalia, including gilded bronze plate armor, he fell into the Tiber around noon. His guards tried to save him, but armor designed to stop swords makes swimming impossible. Maxentius drowned in view of his own soldiers. At 12:10 p.m., Maxentius had reached the Milvian bridge approach, surrounded by 200 Praetorian guards. The bridge was chaos. He couldn't abandon his armor. Roman imperial regalia was political theater. An emperor who stripped off his regalia stopped being emperor. At 12:12 p.m., Maxentius decided to ford the Tiber on horseback. 20 feet from the bank, his horse lost its footing and threw him into the water. One guard grabbed his wrist, trying to pull him up. But pulling a man in full armor from 15-foot deep water is impossible. The guard chose to hold on. Both men drowned together. At 12:14 p.m., Ruricius Pompeianus gave the order that would end the Praetorian Guard's 300-year history. Throw down your weapons. We surrender to Constantine. 10,000 Praetorians laid down their shields. They'd watched their emperor drown and decided survival beat loyalty. The Battle of Milvian Bridge was over. Maxentius's army suffered 20,000 killed. Constantine's casualties, 5,000. Constantine won decisively despite being outnumbered 2.5 to 1. But Constantine's victory at Milvian Bridge meant far more than just another emperor winning another civil war. This was the battle that turned Christianity from a persecuted minority religion into the dominant faith of Western civilization. Constantine attributed his impossible victory to the Christian God, whose symbol he'd ordered painted on his soldiers' shields. In 313 AD, he issued the Edict of Milan, granting Christians freedom of worship. In 325 AD, he convened the Council of Nicaea, where bishops debated Christian doctrine under imperial sponsorship. In 312 AD, Christians represented approximately 10 to 15% of the Roman Empire's population. By 380 AD, just 68 years after Milvian Bridge, Christianity was the official state religion, and approximately 50% of the empire's population identified as Christian. That's the fastest religious transformation of a major civilization in human history. Whether Constantine genuinely believed in the vision or recognized Christianity's political utility is ultimately irrelevant. What matters is the result. One battle turned Christianity from a persecuted sect into an empire's official faith, and that transformation shaped the next 1,500 years of human civilization. Not bad for a man who started October 28, 312 AD, outnumbered 2.5 to 1, betting everything on a god most of his soldiers didn't know. And somehow, through tactical brilliance, cavalry shock, collapsing pontoon bridges, and institutional betrayal, that impossible gamble paid off and changed the world.